not only give a definition of what environmental racism is, but to kind of point out some of the intricacies, or not even intricacies, but to point out some of the examples of what it looks like. So if you are living in a community that's dealing with this, you might not have even realized that you're in a community that is basically under, attack, so to speak, in terms of environmental racism. People's voice. Welcome back. Welcome back. This is the People's Voice. I am Trey Evans, and I am the People's Voice. Thank you again for checking out the podcast this week. It is greatly appreciated. As always, we start off with thank yous. I want to thank all of you who are listening to the podcast and have been listening for the past few months. Want to say thank you, greatly appreciate it. To those who are listening to the podcast for the first time, we say welcome and thank you for listening. It is greatly appreciated. As always, we ask that if this information that we provide on the podcast is enlightening and can be helpful and used, please feel free to share the information and also share the podcast. Information has no power if it's not shared. So we encourage that you please share this information. And then, of course, if this is something that you would like to hear on an ongoing basis, feel free to subscribe to our podcast. Also, you can subscribe to our YouTube channel, and you'll be notified when we release the podcast, which is done every Friday. We release the podcast, and the video for the podcast is released every Friday at 3 p.m. on YouTube. Thank you, and thank you. So today I want to talk about environmental racism. And this is a topic that and a subject that has been talked about. As I say every week when I do research on certain topics, it's like, oh, nobody's talking about this. And then other topics, it's, hit and miss. But this is a topic that I think has been discussed a lot, probably in the, I should say, somewhere in the scientific realm. I don't, in terms of sectors, right? In terms of the environmental industry and things of that nature, I don't think it gets enough mainstream attention. And so, what I want to do today is talk about environmental racism and really give a face to it. I think, sometimes when you hear these terms, it's like, oh, well, what is that? Because it's really a broad label for an occurrence, right? Environmental racism has so many different layers to it that, I'm sure if someone is hearing this for the first time, they're like, well, what is that? And, is this going to just be about, the effects of climate change, which it's not. Environmental racism is a real thing. And it is affecting people of color and people of lower income, specifically people of color. So what I will do is, as always, I will give a definition so we can have a definition to kind of work from, because as you guys all know, I like to give a definition so we have a foundation, puts everybody on the same plane, and then I'll discuss some of the effects of environmental racism. I want to give some examples of what environmental racism is. And then, as always, discuss solutions and some of the strategies that can be used to address this issue. So that's what the topic is today. I'm going to talk about environmental racism. So, I guess I'll start with a definition first. So when I was doing my research, I found a definition from an online magazine called The Nation. And I, I specifically like this definition. I mean, there's tons of definitions out there, but I like to give definitions that are very simplistic, right? Just get right to the point, without all of the, flair and big words and things of that nature. So, this is a definition for environmental racism. And again, this is from thenation.com. It says environmental racism describes the fact that people of color and low income people are most likely to be situated near sources of contamination and away from clean water, air, and soil. That is basically environmental racism in a nutshell, right? It's people of color, lower income people are concentrated in areas where there's high contamination, and that contamination can be from water contamination, air pollution. It can be sound pollution, which a lot of people don't talk about, lighting pollution. There's so many different forms of environmental challenges that people of color deal with. But in a nutshell, it is basically environmental racism is where people of color and lower income are concentrated in areas that have high contamination, high environmental contaminations, and they're away from areas that have clean water, clean soil, open air areas, things of that nature. So that is environmental racism in a nutshell. And now, you may, if after that definition you go, well, I still don't know what it is. I mean, you've probably seen or heard of several examples over the last few years. I guess the one glaring one that many people know about was the water crisis in Flint, Michigan. Even the water crisis that recently occurred in Jackson, Mississippi, or is still occurring in Jackson, Mississippi. Those are examples of environmental racism because in each of those examples, the majority of the people that are affected by those challenges are people of color. So if you, even after the definition, maybe you go, well, what is it? That's an example of environmental racism. And I'm going to discuss that a little bit. What I want to do is kind of provide some other examples of what environmental racism looks like. And really, again, the purpose is to share the information, but to really enlighten people because you may be living in an area not realizing that you are being affected or feeling the effects of environmental racism, especially if you're a person of color, because typically this happens in areas where the people of color are a higher population. So, but that's what I want to do. Let me give a couple of examples of what environmental racism is, or the occurrences of it, so we can maybe identify it. And then, as always, we'll talk a little bit about, excuse me, what we will do to address this issue. Excuse me, one more. Didn't want to clear my throat on the mic. So examples of environmental racism. Let's get into that. And I found this article here from Yes Magazine where they did a great job of laying out different examples of environmental racism. And, this really, for me, this occurred because I was kind of doing a little bit of research, as I do every week when I'm looking to, set the topic and the subject for the podcast. And I was like, wow, this is like super glaring in terms of the discrepancies when it comes to environmental racism. Recently, a EPA report showed that African Americans and other minority groups make up 56% of those living near toxic sites. Okay, 56% of those living near toxic sites. And sites can be refineries, landfills, chemical plants, industrial, next to industries that produce toxic waste. So, but that's what made me initially go, whoa, I gotta, talk about this. So again, an EPA report that was recently released showed that African Americans and other minority groups make up 56% of those living near toxic sites, and that's here in the United States. So, examples of environmental racism. And like I said, I'm reading an article here from Yes Magazine. The article came out sometime last year, but it did a great job of kind of highlighting some of the examples of environmental racism. So let me go through those. And it basically gave a list about 10 different examples. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I did want to hit on some of the ones that I felt are important and can really maybe give someone insight to those who are living in those areas, or individuals who are living in those areas, to kind of begin the process to address that. So one of the first things is that, or an example of environmental racism is that when you have a high concentration of people of color living in areas that have toxic waste sites or landfills or other chemical waste sites, this creates a case of mental health, or this can create mental health issues, I should say. We've had a lot of conversation over the last 5-10 years now of really addressing mental health issues. And oftentimes that conversation is more geared towards some of the social norms that create the pressures, if you will, that create mental health. But I think a lot of time it's not addressed enough about the environment that creates the mental health occurrence. And an example of environmental racism is when you have people of color living in areas that have toxic waste sites, that have landfills, and the psychological effect that has on those individuals can really create mental health issues for the population of that area. So that's one example of environmental racism, when you have individuals who develop mental health issues as a result of living in areas that have many landfills or toxic dump sites and other environmental polluted areas, poor air quality, things of that nature. So that's one of the first examples of environmental racism. The second case, or the second example of environmental racism, is when you have areas where people of color live, and those areas tend to be hotter, okay, than areas where white people or other ethnicities may live that people of color don't live in. So let me explain. Based on a study, and this was according to NPR, there are about 108 urban areas nationwide, and these are areas that were formerly redlined. And for those who may not understand that term, redlining basically was a practice that the government used to use to identify areas that were more riskier than others, and I'm using air quotes, and then that led to mortgage discrimination, things of that nature. But basically, redline areas housed more people of color. So, but in this study from NPR, it says that in a study of 108 urban areas nationwide, they basically saw that on average, the temperature, especially during the hotter months, were 5 degrees higher in a lot of different cities. In some cities, it was as high as 13 degrees higher. Why is that? Okay, so it's hotter, big deal. Well, this is the form of environmental racism because one of the reasons why the areas are much hotter in communities of color, especially in urban communities, is because you have something which is called a heat island effect. And without getting into the science, the deep science of it, basically, when you have areas that have greater concentrations of concrete, right, in those areas, you have the heat from the sun and just the warmer temperatures of the summer. That heat is then concentrated into the concrete, and it almost acts like a oven, if you will. So those areas, those urban areas, get much hotter. Why does this matter? Well, this then leads to other health complications, right? You start having respiratory issues, you start having heat stroke. This is another form of environmental racism because when you have when you have an area where individuals are adversely affected by these type of scenarios or these type of environments, this is where you get environmental racism from. And this is not by accident. This is by design. Matter of fact, let me play this clip from NPR, and they talked about this. I don't know. I think this is from Megan Anderson. She did a piece on this back in 2020, but this was highlighted in terms of the design of these neighborhoods and why they are hotter. Take a listen to this. Let me just clip this out.
And that's not an accident.
Our cities, they're not like jungles where they developed just by natural selection on their own, right? People designed these places, which means they were designed for particular people.
And
so that's not by accident. This design of these areas being hotter, being more heavily concentrated with concrete, no trees, less parks. This is by design. And again, this is another example of how environmental racism is affecting, or I should say environmental racism affects people of color. Environmental racism is the leading cause of death in communities of color. Again, as I highlighted, because of the hotter temperatures and just because the air pollution that comes from living in areas that have toxic sites, landfills, other chemical plants. This is becoming a leading cause of death amongst people of color living in areas where the environmental hazards are much higher than in other areas of the country, especially those countries, those areas of the country that do not have people of color. One of the other examples and the reasons why environmental racism takes place is because many companies believe it's cheaper to pollute communities of color compared to other communities. Why do we say this? Because basically research that has been done has shown that corporations who pollute areas where people of color live, in terms of the fines that they receive for that violation, tend to be much lower. Also, you have a least resistance in areas of color because oftentimes either A, members of the community don't realize, or B, don't feel like they have the power to address these issues. So then they don't go on to try to tackle the issues or try to put legislation or stops in place to change zoning decisions regarding who can and what can come into their communities. Matter of fact, Professor Dorcetta Taylor, who's a professor at Yale, she said research has shown that if you have a corporation who has violated environmental laws, the corporation is going to be fined. But the fines tend to be lower in communities of color, especially in Black communities and poor communities. Again, this is another example of environmental racism. When you have corporations targeting these areas, knowing well that they're polluting these areas, but are not worried about the repercussions from it because they know that they can just pay the fine and they'll keep going on with doing their business. So that's another example of environmental racism. Also, in terms of environmental racism, it doesn't just affect low income communities. And I want to make that point because oftentimes when people hear communities of color, they think, okay, you're talking about poor communities, or I should say low income communities, not poor, but low income communities. And those are concentrated with people of color. Well, that's not the case in the scenario. When I'm talking about communities of color, I'm also talking about middle income communities. Matter of fact, Dr. Robert Bullard, who is considered the father of environmental justice, talked about this very issue on a program on PBS where he was asked about environmental racism, and he talked specifically about the effects that environmental racism has not only on lower income communities, but also middle income communities of color. So take a listen to this.
Housing and mixed use. I tell you another thing. It's not just the housing being segregated, so is pollution. Pollution is segregated, and which means that as you start getting more and more low-income families and families of color concentrated in areas where there's lots of pollution, more and more pollution gets put in those areas. And so you get the segregation of income and race, but you also get the income of pollution. And that's where we say, I wrote a book on this called The Wrong Complexion for Protection. And it means that, and I'm not just talking about race, it's also income. Middle income African Americans are more likely to live in neighborhoods. When I say middle income, I'm talking $50,000 to $60,000, are more likely to live in neighborhoods that are more polluted than whites who make $10,000. You say, how can that be? It means that there is a racial and economic dynamic in housing that allow low-income whites to move into middle-income areas and to exit polluted neighborhoods, whereas institutional racism will keep black families, middle-income, in those neighborhoods.
And exactly as I was saying, so going back to the original point is that not only is this affecting people of color in lower income neighborhoods, but this is also affecting people of color in middle income neighborhoods. So this is a targeted effort and a targeted strategy. This is not just against, this is not about against a class of income. This is against a class of people. So I want to make sure that we have that point highlighted, and I'm glad that Dr. Bullitt pointed that out in that interview there. The last thing I wanted to talk about in terms of examples of environmental racism, and it kind of goes back to the original point, is that these discriminatory practices are being basically allowed by the United States government, right? It's not just a situation where it's this state or it's that state. These are policies that are in place, policies that are not addressing these issues. And this is creating an environment that is literally killing people for generations and generations. Now, I want to play one more clip. There was Michael Regan, who is with the Environmental Protection Agency. He was also asked about this. Now, he took a tour of St. John's Parish down in New Orleans. And why I'm bringing this up is because, like I said, this is a policy from the United States across the country, right? That they're allowing these corporations to do this. Now, the EPA says they're attempting to address this, but I want to play this clip from Michael Regan where he talks about the generational effects from environmental racism and what it's done to this particular part of the country. So take a listen to this, and then we'll go into some solutions on how we can address this. But this is Michael Regan from the EPA discussing the environmental effects, the environmental racism, and the long-term effects that it has on the St. John's Parish.
Water pressure. I talked with families in St. John's Parish who have been exposed to pollution for decades from refineries and other sources of pollution, who are dealing with cancer that spans 3 generations in one household. And so we really got a firsthand look at what some of these communities are dealing with and have been dealing with for quite some time.
3 generations of cancer in these communities, and this is result of living near toxic waste sites. This is a result of being exposed to high amounts of pollution. This is a result of living next to oil refineries, because down in New Orleans, down in Louisiana, there's a ton of offshore drilling that goes on in oil refineries down there. 3 generations of people of color developing cancer as a result of living in areas that are basically concentrated and are implementing environmental racism. So this is a huge issue. And again, I wanted to provide those examples because I thought that it was good to not only give a definition of what environmental racism is, but to kind of point out some of the intricacies, or not even intricacies, but to point out some of the examples of what it looks like. So if you are living in a community that's dealing with this, you might not have even realized that you're in a community that is basically under, attack, so to speak, in terms of environmental racism. At least you can now identify it, and then let's see what we can do to solve this issue. So transitioning, let me just go back just to recap. So first of all, number one, and again, I covered the examples of racism, of environmental racism. This was from Yes Magazine. They had a list of 10. I just wanted to hit kind of some of the highlights. Number one, environmental racism causes mental health issues. Number two, environmental racism contributes, or one of the contributing factors to environmental racism is that many people are concentrated into areas that have much higher temperatures, and those higher temperatures can lead to additional health issues, which is the third one. You have health issues that are occurring as a result of environmental racism that are becoming some of the leading causes of death of people in communities of color because of environmental racism, because they're living near toxic landfills and have mental health, because they're living in areas that are hotter and the temperatures are hotter that are causing other further health complications. And then the other ones is in terms of the lack of the other ones is what I wanted to talk about was that this is a policy by the United States. This is not just, random in terms of just one area of the country. This is across the United States. There are pockets and pockets and pockets. Matter of fact, and I'm going to go into the solutions, but in that NPR article, or that piece that I played, they have a graph here where they show in terms of like just the temperature, and the temperature factor really caught me because I'm like, wow, I didn't even factor that into the conversation. But they have a graph here, and they basically go through about 10 cities where they show the temperature discrepancies in each of them. And Portland, Oregon, in terms of communities of color, had the highest temperature difference compared to communities of affluent white or just white people in general. And, I just have to make it as simple as that. So in neighborhoods of color or red line neighborhoods, you had a higher degree of temperature in those neighborhoods, especially during the warmer months, compared to communities that don't have people of color. And this is throughout the country. And like I said, this graph is on NPR. They've got Portland, Denver, Minneapolis, Georgia, Columbus, Georgia, Jacksonville. I mean, there's a ton of cities on here. Mind-blowing stuff. But let's get into the solutions, right? Because we lament, and I'm big on solutions. So what can we do? Well, one of the first things that we can do is what I'm doing here today is self-education, right? And the only way that you can fight anything is that you have to be enlightened to it, right? You have to find out what the issue is before you can address it. So I would encourage everyone, this is first step. If you're listening to this podcast, hopefully you've got a example, or you gotten the definition of what environmental racism is. Do the research. And I'm telling you, there's a ton of information out here. So it's not going to take, some deep dive. You can just literally put in environmental racism, and then you can start doing the education, self-education for yourself, so you can be awakened to what the challenge is here, and then find out how you can begin to address it. We need to elevate the voices in the community. That's very important. Once you're educated, it's useless if you have the information and, again, you don't share it, right? That's the purpose of the People's Voice. This podcast is to get information out to people so it can be shared. Elevate your voice in your community. Tell somebody, like I always say, tell somebody to tell somebody to tell somebody. Once you find out this information, you've educated yourself, educate someone else, so together you can elevate the voices in the community. The next thing you have to do, and I know many times we are very hesitant about this. And when I say we, I say people of color. And I'm just going to just come down front with it. You've got to hold your elected officials accountable for these things. In this capitalist society, change only comes in three fashions, right? It's either through money, through violence, or through legislation. And I am not an advocate for violence. I'm just telling you the world that we live in. So what I'm saying to you is that you, as an individual, once you've educated yourself, you've elevated the voice in the community, you've told other people, you now have to hold your representatives accountable for this. And this is from the city council person all the way up to your state senator. Send an email, call, stop at the next town hall meeting. When you see those signs talking about notice about zoning or notice about a new build or something like that, you need to either get to that meeting or you need to find out who was in that meeting to find out what was discussed and how you can then address this issue. Because a lot of times these can be headed off at the pass if we collectively address these issues like they do in other affluent or other communities of non-colored people, so to speak. So again, hold your representatives accountable. And that's, again, from the city council person all the way up to the governor. This is not going to happen in my community. This is not going to happen, for our people. So accountability. And then last but not least, you can use the power of boycott. And that's when you find out who these companies are, spread the word and take your dollars out from them. And a lot of times, like I just mentioned down in Louisiana, you have all these refineries, you have all these oil refineries. I know, sometimes we wait till there's a movement to try to jump on it, but a lot of times the movement has to start with you. So, once we identify who these companies are, who these companies are doing business with, or how these companies are polluting our areas, we need to start the process of boycotting these areas and really making our dollars speak louder than our voices. Because again, in this capitalist society, money, legislation makes change. So let's make sure that we are on top of that. So those are the 4 solutions that I researched, that I heavily recommend and think that would be a good way to address these issues in the communities. I encourage each and every one of you to do your own research. You might find something that might be a little bit more applicable, and I am always open to new information. So with that, you can reach us and you can reach me on any of the social platforms. You can reach me at I am Trey Evans. That is IAMTREYEVANS. And that's on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, pretty much everything. And then also the show Instagram is Treybe Talking. That's TREYBETALKING. And I'd love to hear your comments, suggestions, and feedback. We're open to all information. So that's my topic for today, environmental racism. I do hope this was enlightening. I hope that this provided everyone with some great information and that we utilize this information to try to make an impact on it. Again, I was talking from a very high level. When you do your own research, you will find the multiple layers that this particular topic has. But I do hope that this information did serve a purpose today. So that is my time for today. I thank you again for listening. As always, dreams are not just for sleeping. Please wake up and live your dreams. My name is Trey Evans, the people's voice. Tell somebody about the dream. Salute. People's voice.